What's up, guys? This is Matt. Today we are going to discuss the difference between Karl Marx's theory of social conflicts and Emile Durkheim's theory of the social organism. So most of you will know Karl Marx as the founder of communism. He wrote in the mid-1800s the book The Communist Manifesto, along with his best friend Friedrich Engels. And beyond this, he is also considered one of the founders of social science beyond his theory of communism because of his theory of social conflicts. As you read in the reading we had assigned for a previous class, the social conflict theory basically boils down to uh, societies is a construct of a lower class fighting against a higher class, or in Marx's term, this was the proletariat, the working class, violently uprising against the bourgeoisie, which was the upper class. In the Cliget reading we did in class earlier, he specifically defines social conflict theory as saying these classes are in contention and conflict with each other. They struggle for dominance and control, with a consciousness defined by their position, putting politics into all social life. Just breaking that down, when he says these classes, he specifically is referring to socioeconomic classes, both broadly, such as the working class and the upper class, or more specifically, such as breaking it down by profession. When he says they are in contention and conflict with each other, this is exactly what Marx is getting at with his proletariat uprising, as the proletariat believe that the bourgeoisie are trying to, quote, hold them down, as was also seen in Orwellian books such as Animal Farm. And then when he says they struggle for dominance and control, this is the actual fighting between the classes, because as I said, the proletariat view the bourgeoisie as holding them down, and they want to have this right to self-determination. And with a consciousness defined by their position, basically each class sees the world and society through the scope and lens of their class. So the proletariat see everything with a almost unified conscience as it's them against the world. It's a very populist idea. And then lastly, putting politics into all social life. This basically is the conflation between political policy and this social outcome of these conflicts. Perhaps the best modern example of social conflict theory at play is the Occupy movement, where tons of people of all walks of life kind of gathered together to protest what they believe were injustices performed upon them by a hegemon. Similarly, basically any sort of populist movement is an example of social conflict theory. For those that don't know, populism is basically politics that takes the form of an us versus them mentality. Now, is that to say that social conflict theory is the dominant social theory? I can't say with certainty, but I think it is a very convincing theory, because if you think back in history about all the times that a populist movement has been successful, such as the campaign of William Jennings Bryan for president, that wasn't perfectly successful, but it got a lot of people to organize against a dominant foe, if you will, a higher class. And as we'll see in a bit, I think that social conflict theory has a bigger place in our society than as a theory than the social organism. Now, Durkheim's social organism theory basically boils down to one sentence, and that is the collective cannot be explained by looking at the individual. And what this means is when he talks about the collective, he's speaking about society as a whole. And when he says cannot be explained by looking at the individual, it just means that in the grand scheme of things, an individual's consciousness is not important. Rather, society is like an organism, and it has its own consciousness that is an amalgam of all of the individual consciences of people. And what this means is that basically people will cooperate towards a common goal. Now, one of the game in John Nash's game theory is called the cooperation game, which basically predicts that two parties will decide to cooperate when the losses they suffer by both choosing not to cooperate are greater than the reward from one unilaterally not cooperating and the other deciding to cooperate. Next up, I have a clip from SpongeBob where all of the different characters are trying to save themselves from the Alaskan bullworm. And while you can see them all arguing different points and different solutions to this problem, they're all acting more or less as a single consciousness because they're all working towards the same goal, which is to escape from the dangers of the Alaskan bullworm. So let's take a look.
We should lock our doors!
We should call my nephew.
We should dig a moat! We should take Bikini Bottom and push it somewhere else!
So as you can see, the inhabitants of Bikini Bottom more or less are acting like a social organism and that they're working to achieve a common goal. Now, in evaluating social organism theory versus social conflict theory, I think the most important aspect is scale. And I find it's hard to think of an example of the social organism working on a large globalized scale. Similarly, it is hard to think of social conflict working on a large globalized scale. Like, I don't think anyone knows of a class conflict taking place on a global level. That being said, I think that social conflict has a lot larger or a lot better of an argument going for it on a national scale. We've seen it in Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution. We see it in the Middle East right now with ISIS. We see a single group fighting against what they perceive are injustices in the name of Allah by the West. But we also see some aspects of social organism theory on a smaller scale. We see towns of people working together to get a new bridge in their town, despite the differences amongst people. And I think that ultimately boils down to what the economic goal is. Are the economics in place already and these people are then fighting for different goals, or are they trying to achieve a similar economic goal? If it's the latter, then social organism theory will come into play, as Clegget said in his article. But if it's the former and the economics are already in place, I think you are much more likely to see something resembling social conflict theory, such as I said before, the Occupy Wall Street movement. So that's about all I have on this topic. It's whichever one comes into play, I think ultimately boils down to the political economy.